right, hi everybody, David Parsons here. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, and welcome. I hope you enjoy what we've got for you today. Really crazy conversation I had with Richard Kent Evans, who's my guest today. He is the author of a book called Move, An American Religion. Some of you may have heard about this incident called the Move bombing. I think very few Americans know about it, but people on the left tend to know something of it. That in 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department, alongside federal and state authorities, dropped a fucking bomb on a residential neighborhood in Philadelphia. They destroyed 65 houses. They made tons of people homeless. They killed 11 people, including 5 children, all of whom were members of this organization called Move. So what Richard has done in this book is he's gone back and seen, what is the origins of this organization? What is Move? Who was its leader, John Africa? And, he uses the sort of methodologies of history and of religious studies to understand what this organization was about, and also tell the story of how specifically federal authorities treat new religions, particularly black religions in America. This is an unbelievable story. And, we talk about the fact that Heather Ann Thompson, who wrote that really wonderful book, Blood in the Water, on Attica, is now working on a book about the Move bombing, and she's going to uncover sort of the practical operation of how the bombing took place. But what Richard has done with this book is sort of given us a wider picture of what this organization was about, and also, touched on really deep, intense questions about religious freedom and race and state terror in America. All of it is pretty terrifying stuff, and really an extension of the 1960s into the 1980s and even further into the 21st century. All of this stuff really connects, I think, profoundly with the themes we try and hit on this show. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you do too. We've got lots more stuff on our Patreon for our subscribers, where we put a lot of episodes up that are only for subscribers. So if you want to access that stuff and support our show, please do so at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We really appreciate our subscribers. It's really everything to us. And if you want to hang out with us live, you can do that every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific time on our YouTube channel. And again, thanks so much for everyone who's dropping by and making this a conversation more than just us telling you what we think. So again, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and go get Richard Kent Evans' book, Move, An American Religion. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Richard Kent Evans. All right, Richard, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You have a really fascinating book and take on something that I think a lot of people kind of know the skeletal details of, the story of the Move bombing and the Move organization in Philadelphia. But thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
I just want to get the name of your book right, which is Move, An American Religion. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's Move, An American Religion, and it's out with Oxford University Press.
The take on Move as a religious organization, as I'm just familiarizing myself as I was preparing to talk to you today, with sort of the loose historiography of Move. But it seems like your take on it is somewhat new in terms of seeing Move as a religious organization. What brought you to want to study that? I know you're in a religious studies discipline, right? That's what your degree is in.
Yeah, I trained in a subfield called North American Religions, which is another word for American religious history, sort of. I mean, we like to think that there are some different things going on in North American religions, but I was trained in history department, but I did a lot of work in religious studies, and I like to stay active in both fields. And so the reason I landed on this idea that we should think about Move as a religion is because I had never heard of Move, first of all, but before I started grad school, I went to Temple in Philadelphia. And of course, this is a story that Philadelphians know. And it's also a story that, is stored on site at Temple. So the Temple University has this world famous urban archives that holds, 98% of the world's archival material about Move. And so I wanted to dig into this story. At the time, I was doing some reading on some of the basic questions that animate the study of American religion. What gets classified as a religion? What gets classified as secular? What role does race and governmentality play in what gets classified as a religion and what does not? And so as I was kind of having these sort of theoretical debates going on in my mind, I'm entering the archive and reading these papers that Move People produced from the early 70s on. And what struck me right away was that Move People considered themselves religious. They believed that Move was a religion. They believed that John Africa was their prophet, their divine leader in some senses. The document that he produced, the guidelines of John Africa, was their scripture. So they're using sort of all the terminology that we would expect a religion to use. They're making this claim explicitly. Hey, we're a religion. It seems like this is what they were screaming from the archives of me. We're a religion, and this was a surprise to me because my understanding of Move wasn't that they were a religion. It's sort of the way the story has been told has always been, Move is a Black radical group, which is true. Move is a sort of leftist political movement, which has some truth to it. They're, environmentalists is another category used to describe this group. And so these labels just didn't correspond with what Move considered themselves to be. And so I wanted, first of all, to try to explain this disjuncture.
Yeah, it seems like I don't know. I was born in 1978, and people always tell me, and it always comes up in those little like what was happening the year you were born things that you get on your birthday. That the Jonestown Massacre was happening the week that I was born in October of '78, or Jonestown Massacre took place, and it was in the news at the time. And it makes me think, and we've had a couple people on the show. I think Eric Davis is the one I'm thinking about the most. That talk about the 1970s as this time where there was a lot of this going on. This sort of like I don't know if you would call them the birth of new religions, but certainly like a discourse about cults and about, I don't know, the intersection of exactly what you're talking about, like the radical politics of the 1960s, but also this sort of like I don't know how to describe it. Religious element. It sounds like that's sort of what you're doing. How did you come across the Move story? I'm curious because I didn't hear about it either until graduate school, and it's kind of amazing to be raised. I assume you're raised in Philadelphia or raised in?
I'm not.
Sorry.
Yeah, which is partly why I didn't know this story.
There you go. Yeah.
And so as I'm, part of what makes this story so incredible is the United States government at all three levels conspired for well over a year to attack a house in West Philadelphia that contained 13 people who consider themselves to be religious, consider themselves to be practicing their religion in this house. It just almost boggles the mind, A, that this could happen, and it boggles the mind, B, that this isn't a part of our national story. This is 1985. This wasn't that long ago when the Move bombing took place. And so a lot of what's been written about Move before, whether it's from journalists or other authors, has pointed out, hey, why don't we know this story? There's something about this story that leads to its forgetting. And so this is something I try to get at in the book. Why isn't this a story that we all know about, a story that we all tell about the 1980s?
What to go back a little bit, I mean, who is John Africa and what is Move? For people that don't know this story at all, I think that people hear about the Move bombing and they know about that, maybe that element of it happening in 1985. But like we're talking about, it sort of stretches back and is in some ways maybe the legacy of the 60s. So can you tell us a little bit about Move and John Africa in particular? Because it seems like this organization, this individual contains so many different strands of American history and culture.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I do want to kind of bring this story to 1968 because that's the year that say, the world in 68 and Move is one of the possible responses to how to rebuild another society after that collapse. And Move is certainly a part of that. And Vincent Leiphart is a part of that. So John Africa was born, Vincent Leiphart. He was born in 1931, grew up in West Philadelphia. And he's a complex guy. What we know about his early life before he became John Africa is that he didn't receive much formal education. He received as a child a diagnosis, a racist and pseudoscientific diagnosis. But he seemed like he might have had some sort of a learning disorder. He never really was able to read or write very well, though he did did improve those skills as he was an adult. He served in the Korean War. He bounced around between Philadelphia, New York, and Atlantic City for a while in the 1960s, working odd jobs here and there. And then somewhere around 1971, 1970 is when he really begins adopting a new personality. He kind of retreats from the world. A marriage falls apart. He retreats from the world. He kind of ends many of his relationships from before. And when he emerges from this malaise, he brings with him a new a document that other people helped him create. But it's a text. It's an ongoing text that began around 1970 called the Guidelines of John Africa. And this over time will become the sort of textual foundation for this new religion that he's going to invent and move. Around 1972 is when we can say MOVE actually starts as its own sort of religion based around this text and around the prophetic guidance of John Africa. And the way MOVE gets started is that a group of college students in Philadelphia begin reading this text, the Guidelines of John Africa, and they're debating it within the context of a sociology course. And they find some really some ideas that grab them, ideas that are already in the zeitgeist, ideas about far left politics, environmentalism, the relationship between humans and the natural world. It is the Guidelines of John Africa are an expansive document that touch on many different things. It is a coherent theory. This is sort of one thing I want to correct, is that it's easy to dismiss MOVE and the guidelines and the teachings of John Africa in general as sort of it's not something worth paying attention to in its own right. I would like for us to consider that this is an actually important document. I wish it were more available. It is kind of a secret document. MOVE people don't really like other people outside of MOVE to have this document, and they never have. It's not something that you can go buy on Amazon. There are only a few copies of this in the world, but it is a fascinating document, and I wanted to try to get some of this out in the book.
How did you find this document? That's incredible. I feel like we live in an age where there's a sort of assumption. And I think historians and archivists and people who do maybe more advanced academic research know this in more than others, that everything's not online. How did you find that? And tell us a little bit of what's in it, because it sounds like this is a really like intense manifesto in some ways.
Yeah, it is, and its hiddenness attracted me as a scholar of religion. I just wanted to kind of reconstruct this document, and so I was able to reconstruct some of it. I haven't read every word of the guidelines, but here's how I kind of found this document. There are bits and pieces of this in the collection at Temple University. So some of the excerpts from the guidelines are in, for example, police files. Some MOVE produced documents, borrow excerpts from the guidelines. So I was able to kind of reconstruct this lost text from that. As I was working on this project over a course of years, I got to know MOVE people better, and they trusted me more with their story. And so MOVE people showed me some of the texts that I hadn't already come across in other places. And it's also true that some of the Guidelines of John Africa were published publicly before the guidelines became a kind of hidden document. So in the early 1970s, MOVE people had a column in a newspaper where they were publishing the teachings of John Africa for anybody to read. And so I was able to kind of reconstruct some of it from that. But where the story gets interesting is the rest of the manuscript, much of which I haven't read before, I only got access to after I had finished the book. Mostly. I kind of done my final revision. This was my dissertation project. I had done final revisions into a book. And then lo and behold, dropping out of nowhere, I get a message from the National Archives. And when I began this project sometime many years ago, 6-7 years ago now, I put in Freedom of Information Act requests to try to get federal law enforcement records on MOVE. So we have a lot of stuff from the city, the Philadelphia Police Department. We have those records. But when the MOVE Commission that was put together after the MOVE bombing to make sense of what happened, when they tried to gather evidence from federal law enforcement like the FBI, the ATF, even the Secret Service was involved in this, those federal agencies just said, no, we're not interested at all in participating in this. So we haven't known what the federal law enforcement's active role in this was. It's always been sort of an open speculation. MOVE people were quite certain, for good reason, that the federal law enforcement was behind the MOVE bombing. But we didn't know that until this Freedom of Information Act request came through. So I was able to plug in a lot more details about the role the FBI played in this attack, the role even the Secret Service and the ATF played in conspiring this attack. We didn't know this before because these documents had been hidden.
And you've got a blurb on your book I saw from Heather Ann Thompson, who I know wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book on Attica, and we had her on the show a while ago, which was fantastic. And she talked a little bit about how she's working on a book on MOVE, which I assume will take on sort of the structural and practical ways that the whole bombing took place. But your book seems more concerned with categorizing and describing MOVE as a group and what they were about. I mean, how large was MOVE as an organization? How many people did they have? And I guess what was it about them that caught the attention of law enforcement? I mean, obviously, if you're a sort of outwardly black radical group that's sort of professing anti-government attitudes, you're on the radar automatically. But why do you think, why was there such a concern about MOVE?
That's a really great question, and it's ultimately the question is why did the MOVE bombing happen? How do we possibly explain this otherwise inexplicable event? It's hard to explain the level of just sort of callous disregard for human life, at the very least, that went into the decisions made on the day of the MOVE bombing. And so, yeah, my book is kind of an attempt to answer that question. I admit at the very beginning, I'm never going to be able to answer this question. How could this have happened to anyone's satisfaction? But I do think that part of it has to do with this issue of the classification of religion. This is at least how some MOVE people interpreted their history, is that this was a problem of classification. MOVE people believed they had a religion. And they believed that if only people outside the group could recognize that what we have is special, that what we have is a religion, that what we're doing, hey, is, by the way, protected by the United States Constitution. If only people could recognize that, then they believed that they would be able to exist peacefully and do the kind of revolutionary, radical, religious, and spiritual work that John Africa wanted to do. So one way that MOVE people themselves offered for us to interpret their story, to answer this question, how could this have happened, is that they were miscategorized as a religion. And that's true. And I trace that through the book. But I also want to tell another story that often doesn't get told about the sort of long history of the MOVE bombing, that I think can explain how the relationship between MOVE and the city of Philadelphia became so violent. And it has to do with an event that happened in 1976. The story is something like this. So MOVE people are at this time living in a neighborhood called Powelton Village, which is in West Philadelphia. And they have a house on 33rd Street there. And they're living communally in the way they would in the later house that's bombed in 1985. And in March of that year, 1976, MOVE people are coming home from jail. MOVE people had already been subject to hundreds of arrests over the previous year. So a few MOVE people had recently won a court case. They're arriving home. They had a bus that they used to transport many MOVE people back and forth. To answer your question, around this time in 1976, there are about 30 to 40 MOVE people. And it's a very small group in 1970. So to continue our story, MOVE people are arriving home. It's early morning. It's like 2 or 3 a.m. They're excited, right? They're happy. They're making noise. MOVE people in the house come out to greet them. There's this sort of happy, welcome home sort of atmosphere. The police are already there. So the police have already, by this point, begun monitoring MOVE 24/7. Cop cars arrive. They begin sort of, a scuffle ensues between MOVE and the police. And at the end of this scuffle, several MOVE people are arrested. There is a fight between police and MOVE. And then when kind of the dust settles, MOVE people learn that Janine and Phil Africa's newborn son, whose name was Life Africa, had been killed, ultimately by the police. The police had struck Janine, Life's mother, on the head with a baton. Janine fell over and crushed Life beneath her.
Mm.
So this is a huge turning point for MOVE, right? Before this, demonstrations were about bringing the truth of John Africa into the world, about kind of drawing attention to some of the obvious contradictions in what MOVE people call the system, we might call society. But this episode, The Death of Life Africa, changes MOVE. This is the origin story for the MOVE bombing that's going to happen years later.
Wow. I mean, it feels like there's animosity that grows. That seems like that story explains a lot of it and explains sort of the genesis of it. Because isn't there a shootout in '78 as well? That's sort of what 2 years later. Is that directly related to that incident?
Yeah, exactly. It's all tied back to this incident. So after the fight with the police, MOVE changes its stance on nonviolence. So prior to prior to the Death of Life Africa, MOVE espoused a position of nonviolence. After the Death of Life Africa, MOVE embraced armed self-defense, sort of the same doctrine of the Black Panthers, for example. And the doctrine isn't that MOVE is setting out to commit violence. Their position was that if the police are going to attack our house with knives, we'll fight them with knives. If the police want to attack our house with guns, we'll fight them with guns. It was a defensive posture. And MOVE people announced this change in an incident called the Guns on the Porch standoff. And so on this day, again, police are always monitoring what MOVE are up to. So they're watching all of this happen. MOVE people come out of their house. They're kind of parading up and down the porch, and they're holding, for the first time, rifles. The police had never seen MOVE people hold weapons before this. So it scared them. 200 police officers show up. A standoff ensues. The police are like, standing off against MOVE people as they're just holding weapons. And it will come out many years later, by the way, that MOVE people didn't actually commit any crimes that day. Black people are allowed to hold guns too. This is something that seemingly was a surprise to the Philadelphia Police Department too. But there were some crimes committed in terms of the guns being brandished, but those were committed by an FBI informant who was trying to take down the group anyway. So MOVE people didn't actually commit any crimes that day. That led to the standoff. But after the standoff ends, it ends peacefully, in part because the neighborhood, Powelton Village, sides with MOVE against the police. This standoff ends peacefully, but it begins a year of the Philadelphia Police Department establishing a blockade of the first MOVE house. Eventually, this blockade, which is ordered by the very infamous mayor, Frank Rizzo, was a starvation blockade. Their plan was, we just want to arrest MOVE people. They won't come out of the house. So the plan is we'll starve them out. The city shut off the water. They shut off all access to any other utilities. They put up a police barricade that banned food and water from being carried into MOVE. There are children in this house, by the way. Mm-hmm. The police are setting out to starve them out of the house. This was the explicit plan all along. Okay, that armed standoff ends on May 20th, 1977. I'm sorry, no, that was the date for the Guns on the Porch standoff. The date that the standoff ends is August 8th, 1978. Now, this is an important date in MOVE's history, August 8th, 1978. The police decide, we've spent too much money on this blockade. We need to just go in and arrest MOVE people. So they attack MOVE headquarters. This attack leads to an exchange of gunfire between MOVE and the police. And as a result of this exchange of gunfire, Officer James Ramp was killed. Now, MOVE people will claim that Officer James Ramp was killed by friendly fire. I've looked at the evidence. I'm not convinced by that. I think Officer James Ramp was probably killed by someone shooting from the MOVE house, but we don't know for sure. But my reading of the evidence is that MOVE people are probably responsible for that murder. Now, so the sort of the next stage in this story is that 9 MOVE people are arrested for that. Mm-hmm. They are sentenced to prison for the murder of Officer James Ramp and the shootout. They're sentenced collectively as a group, which is sort of an unusual thing to do when you're dealing with a murder case. But the judge at the time said, you know what, MOVE presents themselves as a group in court, so damn it, we're going to convict them as a group. This collection of defendants, the MOVE 9, would become one of the most famous groups of they consider themselves political prisoners. They were recently released. There's just a good story, a good ending to the Move 9 story. But that's the origin story of the Move 9.
Wow. And I mean, talk about animosity. I mean, it's hard. It's easy to sort of make correlations to other incidents in American history that have been like this. And I don't want to necessarily make those direct connections because every story is different. But it reminds me of, I was young when in the 90s when the Waco thing happened, and it seemed like the initial exchange of gunfire there, in which law enforcement officers were killed, created a sort of scenario of revenge almost. It was like, we're going to come after this group. Like, this group becomes then classified as a terrorist organization. At what point does that happen? Because it seems like you were leading towards a sort of scenario in which the U.S. government and all these other sort of figures of authority, particularly in Philadelphia, are going to say, this isn't a religious organization. This is a terrorist organization. I imagine it happens around 1978 when a cop is killed there. But how does that sort of, I guess my question is, how does that sort of amp up and lead to the Move bombing? But also, I'm curious about, like, sort of, you mentioned the neighborhood supporting Move. I wonder if that shifts. Does that change? Because I know, at some point Move is like, people are making noise complaints about them, and there's sort of like, they've got to be unpopular among certain people in the neighborhood too. But I wonder, because it seems like it might be a split in the neighborhood. I know that there's, I don't know, in the 70s and 80s, there's like a sort of like move towards the Democratic Party, or like, there's a certain sort of social conservatism among Black Americans in cities happening. I wonder what's the relationship between like the larger Black community, without treating that like a monolith, but like, the larger Black community and the civil rights movement and how does Move fit into that world? I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. Move's relationship with their neighbors is kind of the category that we might,
right.
might use. So early on in Move's history, they were incredibly popular around West Philadelphia, especially around Powelton Village. Early in Move's history, and we might say this is before 1976, the death of Life Africa, Move people are known as a group of people who can, help solve or help negotiate ends to sort of the cycle of gang violence. They're working hard to help people get clean. They're doing a lot of work around animals, stray dogs, and things like that around the neighborhood. So they're helpful people, especially in the beginning. This is one reason why after the Guns on the Porch standoff, this is one reason why the kind of community overwhelmingly supported Move against the police. That's part of it. Move people were helpful. And there are always stories from Move's neighbors, even through 1985, that they could be incredibly nice, wonderful people to have as neighbors. They could also be really awful people to have as neighbors. Move people, I wouldn't want to live next to Move people in 1983 and 1984, right? They're always on their bullhorn, making pronouncements even in the middle of the night. I mean, they're walking across people's roofs. They're doing scary things that are understandably irritating to their neighbors. But how do we get from an irritating neighbor situation to bombing the entire city block out?
Right.
Is a huge leap that sort of neighborhood complaints can't possibly explain. One other dynamic that's at play with Move and their neighbors there were two different Move houses, and both of them ended in destruction from the government. So the first Move house, which was on North 33rd Street in Powelton Village, this is situated in a neighborhood that's kind of perfect for this kind of group to emerge. They're not the only commune in this neighborhood, right? This is a lefty neighborhood. It's right between sort of Drexel and some of the other universities of that area. So it's a multiracial neighborhood. It's a left-leaning neighborhood, and it's a neighborhood that's likely to side with Move over the police and sort of conflicts like that. But the second Move house was in a very different neighborhood. It was on Osage Avenue in West Philadelphia, about a mile and a half from the first Move house. And this is a very different neighborhood, in part because it's a more upwardly mobile neighborhood. It's still a predominantly Black neighborhood, but the kind of people who are living there tend to be people who are sort of, professionals. These houses cost more, so those neighbors were less, less tolerant towards move. Even so, in the early years of that move people were popular with their neighbors. That changed over time as move grew more sort of, inward, and as the date of the move bombing was approaching, move became, more obnoxious to their neighbors and more dangerous to their neighbors. That's certainly the case. But again, the neighbors are also victims of the move bombing. Osage Avenue was destroyed. 64, 65 houses in total were burned all the way to the ground from that too. So they're also a part of this story.
Well, yeah. I mean, I lived in Sunset Park in Brooklyn for many, many years, and looking at the sort of bird's eye view of this destroyed block of buildings look very, very much like the block I lived on, and it's unbelievable, the destruction. I don't know. I mean, I'm sitting here saying people know the move bombing, but I think most Americans don't even know the story of the bombing itself. It's sort of, as much as like you think about Waco, everybody knows Waco, right? Like that seems like and there's all sorts of racial politics to that, I'm sure, as well. I'm wondering about the animal rights stuff and the environmental stuff. Where does that come from? Because it seems like reading just about move in a broad sort of way, it seems like that's something that's mentioned a lot. Is this sort of, it's an organization that's sort of an amalgamation of Black radicalism, but also this like environmentalism and animal rights concerns. I mean, I know about the Black Panthers breakfast program, and there were like, there was this sort of like engagement with vegetarianism and food among the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, but why was that such a big part of what Move was doing? It seems like it was central to them. I mean, they were trying to like liberate zoos and do all sorts of stuff related to animal rights.
That's right. So the way to understand what Move is up to is to kind of get to the core of their theology. And so the way to understand what John Africa was trying to teach about humans' relationship with the world and humans' relationship with God is that John Africa divided the universe into sort of what's good and what's bad. And so what's good is the natural world, the world as God created it. What's bad is everything that we as humans have done to the world since sort of the dawn of human consciousness. According to John Africa, we've been dividing up something that's essentially one. He sees the natural world as essentially one unit, and that there's something with the human mind that forces us to create divisions and abstractions. So an example of a division would be numbers, colors. We have to, and this is just true. This is part of how human brains work. This is part of how we make sense of our world. We divide things, we categorize things, we give them names. And so this gives rise to, over time, and of course, this is a mythology that's not necessarily a chronological mythology. This is an explanation for the universe as it is, right? Over time, all of these systems that we have created become things like governments, like money, like economics. He writes a lot about economics as sort of as one way that he considers deeply irrational and anti-life of interacting with our natural world. So the solution to this, the problem that these abstractions and divisions create, culminates in this thing called the system. And this is a big concept for John Africa. It's kind of the whole point, is that we are, as humans, trapped in the system, a capital T, capital S on that. And we can't really understand the system until we have pulled ourselves all the way out of it. Now, the only way to really pull yourself out of it is to sort of undo all the process of human knowledge. You've got to refine yourself as a human being, as a part of the natural world, to kind of encounter the divine within the earth as you encounter it. It's not a very supernatural theology. John Africa thinks about God as something that is personal. So it is a she within the text of guidelines of John Africa. God is feminine. God is a divine feminine. And God, according to John Africa, is both transcendent from the world and immanent in the world. So God is the force that's blowing the wind. God is the force that's kind of raising crops from the ground. All of the movement that we see around us, the forces that animate life are synonymous with God. And yet God is also apart from that, and that there's a path to God. John Africa thinks that only two people have really successfly found their way out of the system. One is John Africa. The other is Jesus Christ, which makes one think about Move's relationship to Christianity.
Yeah, I wondered. I mean, what is that relationship to Christianity? Because we talk a lot about. I mean, I feel like in a very sort of mainstream narrative of the civil rights movement, even Christianity plays a very particular role, and then it doesn't, right? Or then it evolves, in the late '60s and '70s, and these groups go in different directions. But it seems like there's a transition point too, and it feels like Move is sort of on that fulcrum. Is Christianity in the Move ideology?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we can certainly find traces of this. John Africa was raised in the Black church. He grew up attending a Black Baptist church in West Philadelphia. And so we can see some overlap between John Africa's concept of the system and the Christian theodicy of the fall. There are a lot of sort of echoes of certain understandings of Genesis in the guidelines of John Africa, but he is trying to kind of create a fundamentally religious text, in that he is trying to kind of correct Christianity at some time. So that there are some very revealing passages in some of his sections on Jesus and on the nature of God, for example, that sound like he's interested in grappling with the Christian tradition. Which is something that we didn't know before, and that's fascinating to me as a scholar of religion, that he's having these debates. But it's also the case that Move people are throughout the 1970s spending a lot of time debating other religions, and so they're talking about theology when they're doing that. They're trying to say, here's how you, as Buddhists, for example, the Buddhists were one group that Move people interacted with in a confrontational way. And Move people were saying, what's wrong with you is your conception of God. And if your conception of God was more like John Africa's, then we could fix your system. In some ways, the truth that John Africa was bringing to the world what kind of transcended religious categories, he believed, because he does want to change the Christian tradition, but he wants all human beings to have transcended this, again, divisive, human-invented concept of religion in the first place.
The words that come up in my head when you're describing the attitude towards the system and how we need to get back to a sort of basic humanity apart from all this conditioning. I mean, it sounds like anarcho-primitivism. I mean, that's the words that come into my mind. And I think about communes in the 70s. So many of them were doing in my head at least, many of them are white, although there are lots of exceptions. And many sort of diverse communes as well. But it seems like that Move is not necessarily back to the land. They're they strike me as different in the sense of they're like an urban group. How do they square that? What are they doing in Philadelphia? Why aren't they moving out to the farm and being separatists? Because it seems like, I don't know. There's an attitude of sort of objecting to everything that's happening in the society, at the same time a desire to sort of engage with the society in one way or the other.
Yeah, there's always this tension between wanting to escape the system and kind of save other people who are still trapped in the system. The vision for Move that was never realized because of police surveillance at the very beginning and because of other forms of police repression throughout their history, the vision of Move that they wanted to realize was that they would do exactly what you're talking about. They would have sort of a big farm, maybe an hour outside of Philadelphia. They wanted to keep the original Move house, the one in Powelton Village, as sort of a sacred space. I think the word shrine is actually used to describe what they imagined this place would be. It's a place where people could come learn the teachings of John Africa. It was going to function as sort of like a school. They were going to get a printing press and start publishing things. That was the vision. This sort of living as human beings in full communion with the divine as the natural world. That was the vision. And so as Move is kind of fighting to exist, a lot of people come along saying, look, there should be an easy solution to this problem. The easy solution is let's just get these people out of the city where they're bothering their neighbors and bothering the police. Let's get them out of the city to a place where they can live peacefully. And there were at least 2 moments in MOVE's history where they were very close to achieving that vision. For a while after the death of Officer James Ramp, many MOVE people fled Philadelphia, in part because they were responsible for the death of the police officer, including John Africa. So John Africa leads a contingent of MOVE people up to Rochester, New York. They go underground. They change their names. They don't advertise that they're MOVE. They're just people who've arrived in Rochester. They begin fixing up sort of old, dilapidated houses. Eventually, they procure a filling station, and they're doing some work there, so they're bringing in income, and it's starting to look like what MOVE was supposed to be before all of this happened, right? So they were tantalizingly close to having kind of that in Rochester before the police and ATF and the Rochester police, by the way, raided that house in 1981. They put an end to MOVE's one of MOVE's offshoots after the death of Officer James Ramp. This is actually an interesting story. So in 1981, the police raided the house in Rochester. They put an end to the Rochester contingent, and they put John Africa on trial. Now, this was the whole point. The whole point of the raid, I have the police saying this verbatim. The whole point of the raid was to stop John Africa, because if they didn't stop John Africa, he'd just go somewhere and convert somebody else. That was the police rationale for why they did this raid. They arrest John Africa and everybody else that's part of this MOVE underground in Rochester, and they put John Africa on trial. Federal terrorism charges. The U.S. government alleges that John Africa had entered into a conspiracy to blow up federal courthouses and other buildings. The conspiracy at some points was explained that MOVE people were planning to blow up hotels around the world in order to bring attention to the imprisoned MOVE 9. And so they put John Africa on trial. John Africa represents himself. Now remember, this is someone with very little formal education. He represents himself against these charges. And it becomes quite clear, at least in my reading of the court transcript and in the jury's reading, that the government had just made all of this up. The government had been using informers to kind of bring down MOVE from the very beginning. Donald Glassy is a figure that is sometimes told as sort of a co-founder of MOVE. He is at some times explained as a key early figure. One of the stories told about Donald Glassy, who was a white college professor. He was the one who was originally teaching the guidelines of John Africa in his course. And so the story had been, this was sort of the white guy, right? The white guy in the group that organized things, got things off the ground. That's all a lie. Donald Glassy was an informant, and I kind of detailed what I can say for sure about that is detailed in
that name Donald Glassy comes up when I was reading about MOVE before you and I spoke, and the name comes up most as the guy that transcribed John Africa's sort of vision, because John Africa was not literate at the time that these guidelines were written. So the idea, I mean, this is starting to sound like a lot of the stuff of like when the FBI is like catching terrorists in like the early in the 2000s. And then when you look at the story, you realize that it was like just some kid who had like a learning disability, and like he was surrounded by these FBI dudes that started like ejecting ideas and then put a bomb on. I mean, they set these people up. And it seems like, God, the idea of Glassy being an informant is nuts. Was he actually a professor too, though?
Yeah, he was an adjunct professor at the Community College of Philadelphia, which is where the first and so I feel comfortable saying, and the evidence proves, we have Glassy himself testifying under oath that he was working for federal law enforcement.
A stain on the history of adjunct professors.
Exactly. In his story, I can't come out and say exactly what I believe because I don't have all the evidence, but I think readers can read what we know about Donald Glassy and how he found his way to this group. And I think there's filling some of the dots there. But we do know he was an informant, I think, by 76. But I suspect that from the very beginning, he was an informant for law enforcement.
do you read the Move story? And I'm wondering, because I'm sort of ignorant of the historiography. Do people read the Move story as part of the larger sort of campaign from the federal government against black radicalism and against white radicalism too? I mean, I think I'm thinking about the Weather Underground and different incidents in the '70s, especially. But I mean, it seems like this was a longer. People often tend to call this the '60s, but it seems like the '60s are happening, for decades on either end. But how much of it should we read as sort of like this, murder of Fred Hampton, COINTELPRO, this really ugly history of the U.S. government waging war? I mean, it seems like the Move bombing fits into that, right? I mean, is that something that is becoming more and more, I don't know, public knowledge? It seems like your book is part of bringing that to us.
Yeah. My book is partly bringing that to us. We just didn't know what role the federal law enforcement played in the Move bombing until I got those files, until they decided to let me see them. And so we know a lot more now. And I think we'll know a million times more once Heather Ann Thompson's book comes out, because I really do think I'm confident that she's going to find all of the evidence that can lay out exactly what role the federal law enforcement played in this. But we do know that the FBI was deeply interested in Move from very early on. We know that the city of Philadelphia had a very Orwellian sounding squad called the Civil Disobedience Squad that worked hand in hand with the FBI, Hoover's FBI, and they shared files. And they're essentially working together against Move from the very beginning. The police were really watching Move. As soon as they moved in together, the police were right there watching, recording everything. They got informants in there very quickly. They were keeping a very close watch on any left-leaning group in Philadelphia at this time, and any black group at this time could just know that the Civil Disobedience Unit was there somewhere. Wow. They always were, and they're still around. They're called the Civil Affairs Unit today, but yeah, they were absolutely working close with the FBI. The FBI opened up multiple investigations out of the Philadelphia field office into Move in the 1970s. The director of the FBI himself, I think this is the second director after Hoover, I can't remember his name, but the director himself read the guidelines of John Africa. And that was a part of those FBI files that I was able to track down. They had excerpts from an early version of the guidelines of John Africa. The FBI had it the whole time. They were absolutely aware of Move, tracking them from the very beginning, and importantly, asking this question of what kind of group is Move. The very first report that I was able to, the earliest report on Move comes from, I think, 1973. Very, very early days. At this point, Move is basically an unlicensed car washing operation. It's basically roommates, right? There's 5 or 6 people who live in a house. It's a tiny, tiny group. Already the police are investigating, and they're trying to ask this question: what kind of group is this? How do we make sense of this new thing that has spawned here in West Philadelphia? And they asked, is this a religion? Is this a philosophy? We asked Move people. They just walked up and said, hey, what are you? What do you believe? Move people said, yeah, we're kind of a philosophy, but we're more than a philosophy because we got it figured out. We're a religion. We're Move. We're the truth, right? And so the police go back and say, okay, what kind of group is this? And they decide it can't be a religion. It can't be a philosophy. The only thing it could possibly be is a fascist group. So the very first category is fascism, to make sense of Move. And so from right there, you have this the story that Move people are pointing to that says they just didn't understand us. They didn't want to understand us, and they didn't want to try. I do want to talk about the connection between Move and sort of this longer history of federal law enforcement repression. There's a very, very great new book on this, The FBI and Religion. This is Sylvester Johnson and Steve Weitzman. And they go back through the sort of even the agencies that predated the FBI, and they show how they were always doing this to Black religions. A lot of the techniques that law enforcement agencies are using now against American Muslim groups, for example, they're pioneered on African-American religions. In some ways, you can't understand African-American religions without understanding that at the same time all of this is happening, there's an informant in the room in all likelihood. The FBI was absolutely obsessed with monitoring, with suppressing forms of Black religion that they didn't like.
Wow, that's an angle I haven't really considered specifically before, because I mean, what period is this? Are we talking about here? Like, at what period would we say that there is a phenomenon of like black religion that's sort of happening, connected or not connected to a political movement. I mean, when is this happening? When is this concern growing?
Well, there's one story that we can tell about, a more specific story about federal law enforcement. And that does begin really with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, though there are plenty of examples of the agencies that predate the FBI doing the same kind of work. But it's also true that if we kind of think bigger about what we mean by policing and suppressing religions, it's hard to say where this story starts, because we can look at in sort of ecstatic forms, quote unquote, ecstatic forms of black religion in the 19th century being policed as insanity. This is a project that Judith Weisenfeld at Princeton is working on right now. It depends on what your definition of policing is. There's always going on, and as soon as these agencies come into being, their primary target seems to be forms of radical black religion that they can't control. The federal law enforcement tends to want to suppress those.
Yeah, I mean, it has power, right? I mean, religion has power. And I mean, it seems like to me, and I'm guessing here, that, the FBI are seeing themselves as protecting, quote unquote, the system, capital T, capital S. And one of the ways that the system functions is sort of, that religion has a particular place, and it seems like, I don't know, I'm thinking about the environmental element of it too, because it's something about capitalism there. It seems like, I don't know, the government goes hard against environmentalists, and go like really hard. And I'm thinking about like during the Bush administration, I think during Obama as well, there were federal terrorism guidelines that were sort of expanded to directed at animal rights activists and groups that were quote unquote eco-terrorist groups. And I think it was, something like expanding the sentencing guidelines for people that committed property crimes like arson to, even when there was no violence there. In other words, there was something like really ideologically repugnant to the federal government when it comes to environmental activism. I wonder, I mean, it seems like that's part of the death sentence that MOVE meets is partly tied to that.
Yeah, what is it about MOVE that made the state so angry? Right? What is it about MOVE? And MOVE people have answers to these questions, and my answer to this question has a lot to do with religion itself, with the actual category of religion, how it functions in the modern United States. One of the most awful true things about the MOVE bombing is that the decision to kill the kids seemed to be fairly deliberate. I mean, there's a lot of dancing around the fact that children were killed in the MOVE bombing, and that the police knew the city knew the children were in there. There were opportunities to take these children away before this attack. If you're intent on killing the adults, there was at least a way of removing the children before that happened. Whatever Department of Human Resources, whatever that was going to do this, just didn't get notified. It seemed like a memo dropped, and nobody cared enough about the lives of these children to ever consider, hey, maybe we shouldn't attack them with bombs from a helicopter to kill everybody in this house. There also seems to be a deliberate decision to kill the children with the fact that, and this is another thing that's been rumored for a long time that we can now confirm is true, that the police were shooting at MOVE people as they tried to escape. So let me explain what happened, the MOVE bombing itself. One thing that I want to correct about the MOVE bombing, an additional thing, is that this was not an improvised accident. One of the narratives that emerged out of the MOVE bombing was that this just got out of control, right? We had bad leadership. At any point, things could have gone better. It was just kind of one bad decision after another. I call this in the book the bumbling politicians narrative. And there's, that's a narrative that Americans are likely to believe, right? That this is just a tragic chain of bad, stupid decisions that resulted.
I don't want to mean to interrupt, but that's the story of the Vietnam War for most Americans, right? It's just like, well, we somehow killed millions and millions of people over 12 years by bumbling our way into it. It's a really weird way of sort of escaping responsibility and agency there.
On that note, let me read you the historical marker on the MOVE bombing that was just put up very recently. And you can imagine the controversy surrounding this as Philadelphia decides, how are we going to commemorate this thing that happened here? Let me just read to you what it is. And I think it's exactly to your point. On May 13th, 1985, at 6221 Osage Avenue, an armed conflict occurred between the Philadelphia Police Department and MOVE members. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter dropped a bomb on MOVE's house. An uncontrolled fire killed 11 MOVE members, including 5 children, and destroyed 61 homes. Now, you could read that and think that this was an act of God, right? This just the thing that just happened. It's an incredibly elusive statement. It's a statement that does not tell the truth about what happened that day. And what happened that day is that the police, law enforcement at all 3 levels, federal, state, and the city of Philadelphia, had been conspiring for over a year to eradicate and move people. They wanted to destroy the house. They wanted to kill the people inside. They tested dropping bombs from helicopters more than a year in advance. This was not an accidental decision made that day. This was just a lie, and it's a lie that has become truth because people in power have been telling the story so far. They attacked this house early in the morning, May 13th, 1985, with 300 police officers, firefighters, and other first responder personnel. They were armed with military-grade weapons that they had borrowed from the FBI field office. They also borrowed from the FBI field office a bundle of C4 explosive that they used to combine with Tovex, which is an explosive that's used in mining to actually move things. They combined this to make like a 4-pound improvised explosive device that they dropped from that helicopter onto the house. It was a huge bomb meant to combust. The whole point of adding C4 is that it combusts into flames. The fire spreads. The city decides to let the fire burn. This is the famous quote. There's a very great documentary about the MOVE bombing called Let the Fire Burn. That was a conscious decision. Hey, let's use this fire to our tactical advantage to force MOVE people out of the house. And you know what? It worked. The MOVE people that were still alive by that point tried to flee out the basement. At this point, we're talking about the kids. The kids were running out of the basement, and the police shot at them as they tried to escape. Again, this was the plan all along. There were stakeout units on the buildings across the street to shoot people who tried to escape. As these children are running for their lives from this growing flame that they've been trapped in for hours already, they're shot at by the police. And one of the victims of the MOVE bombing, Tommaso, was found with buckshot pellets in his body. He was shot by the police trying to escape the fire.
Wow. This whole story is just, to me, like, I mean, the way that it's sort of put there on the plaque, you know, it's a story. I mean, it's about memory, you know, and it's about what we remember and how we remember. It does remind me of Attica in the sense of like that the public memory is almost opposite to what actually happened. But it even, I mean, you talk about Vietnam, and I mean, so much of this is tied to that era. You know, of how much of this history has been buried, but even the way we memorialize publicly. I mean, the Vietnam Memorial itself is famous for just being a blank wall that it just has the names of dead people on it, and it doesn't explain how they died, why they died, or, you know, what were the circumstances that created the war itself. So I don't know. You've done really amazing work, and I thank you so much for sharing this stuff with me. I have so many other questions. I mean, just really quickly, because it comes up. I mean, it seems like that psychedelic drugs are like one tool that people in the counterculture were using to sort of decondition themselves. Did that ever enter into the discourse of the MOVE organization, or how were they trying to get back to that primitive state? Because it seems like that's a key part of their whole operation.
The human body is central to how to escape the system. And the way you use your body, in a sense, the system is to live in perfect harmony with Mother Nature, is the line that John Africa would use. And that includes avoiding anything that could be considered a distortion of your body's natural body chemistry. So John Africa taught that MOVE people did not smoke, they did not drink, no weed, nothing at all. Very, very clean living. MOVE people were and are super healthy. They were doing sort of a raw foods vegan thing before that was cool. They live naturally in any way they can, with their hair, with their grooming practices. It's all natural. They used garlic at one point as kind of a deodorant. They're really serious about purifying the body to kind of clean it from these distortions that are pulling you closer to the system. early on in Move's history, they even had these things called distortion days, which were kind of like cheat days. It was a day that I know you're missing that cheeseburger. Go eat the cheeseburger. It's fine.
Wow.
Come back to Move House, and we'll all keep going back to normal. So yeah, food, health, the body is crucial to this. And one story on how important the body is actually really central to this story about Move's religious classification. There was a famous trial in 1981 involving a Move defendant who had been in prison who was requesting the Move diet as a prisoner. So he's making the case to prison officials, if I were Jewish, I would have access to a kosher diet. So I belong to Move. I ought to have access to a Move diet, which meant for him that he would need more fruits and vegetables. He couldn't eat the meat. He couldn't eat a lot of the processed food being served at prison. He just wanted more fruits and vegetables. He wanted to be able to take them back to his cell. And prison officials objected to this because, you can make wine out of that. So that was a non-starter. This question goes all the way to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And they have to ask, this court has to decide, is Move a religion? This is the question being faced by the court. Is Move a religion? So they use this test to decide whether or not Move is a religion. In my reading, and I think in the plain reading, Move is absolutely a religion under this three-part test that the court has devised. In fact, almost anything would count as a religion under this three-part test that the court has devised. And yet we see in this ruling, the judge coming up with he's doing all sorts of logical gymnastics in order to show, no, Move is definitely not a religion. And for that reason, this prisoner does not deserve to have his diet accommodated in prison. But the other side of this from Move people is, no, this is our religion. We have to follow this diet. There is only one way. It's an all-in system or it's not at all. So you can't pick and choose this part and say, I'm a Move person, but I'm not doing the Move diet because I'm in prison. It doesn't work that way. They're saying you cannot be an authentically religious person as a Move person unless you've also followed this diet.
Wow, that reminds me of the QAnon shaman, the guy arrested at the Capitol. I don't know if you saw this, but there was outrage from, I think, liberals and lefties who were upset that this guy was getting access to the vegan diet that he subscribed to and claimed was part of his sort of shamanistic practice. And there was it's funny because there was a lot of laughing about that and memeing about it. But I thought, well, isn't this something that we should value in terms of people's religious traditions, particularly when it comes to something as intimate as nutrition? I mean, you laugh if we want, but it seems like the laughter is kind of hiding something and hiding our real discomfort with actually addressing whether that's a right or not, and whether or not that's a right that we value. When it's odd, because it seems like religious liberty is, I've been told since I was a kid, is sort of like the bedrock of American freedom. So when you hear about the way that whether it be the carceral system or law enforcement or whatever, the federal government attacking these groups, it's sort of, it should be something that is a concern about American democracy. And yet some of the loudest voices about that stuff are not talking about Move very much. It's a story that doesn't really, I find that Move doesn't really fit neatly into a particular ideological category for people. And that might explain why we don't get hot takes on it all the time.
That's right. And so one reason why, so let me just say that I think I'm speaking on behalf of most scholars of American religion when I say that we're pretty down on the idea of religious liberty as a thing that can work for everybody. I think we're now sort of being forced to admit that religious liberty has always been about protecting, white Protestant hegemony wherever you see it. And this is kind of what religious liberty talk has always been. And Tisa Winger is the kind of iconic scholar that we all turn to for teaching us this. And this is part of that story. It also should tell us something about how much religion is raced. It's so much easier for the United States government to see religion when it's white. But the United States government has a very hard time seeing religion when it's not white, which I think tells us something important about the category of religion itself.
Yeah, and how systems are used to protect a sort of identity, and a sort of religious identity that's been part of the whole project since the very beginning. It's really, really scary stuff and really deep stuff. And thanks, Richard, so much for coming on and explaining this to us, because it's a story that I think people more and more are talking about and ought to be, because it connects so deeply with with the politics of our age, as we wonder if QAnon is a religion and that sort of thing. I mean, they're big, big, crazy questions. But thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, I think that's going to do it for today. I want to thank my guest, Richard Kent Evans. Go check out his book, Move: An American Religion. I cannot tell you how dark and disturbing and important this work is. And I think Nostalgia Trap listeners especially will appreciate the kinds of angles and questions that Richard is bringing to the whole move bombing narrative beyond the typical kind of ideological political stuff we get when you hear people talk about this moment. It's a really complicated event, and I think Richard's take on sort of understanding what MOVE as an organization was and what they were trying to do is a really vital part of understanding what it means. So thank you, Richard, for talking with us about it, and thanks for everyone that's subscribing to the show and helping us keep going. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We really appreciate it. Lots of bonus episodes and other stuff for our subscribers on the site. And thanks so much. We'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.